great content on a Thursday night from such a fantastic author and speaker as Eric. Really looking forward to the program. But I did want to take a second just to tell you a little bit about things that are going on at the museum. Obviously, the galleries remain closed, but I wanted to reassure everybody that while the galleries remain closed, we've managed to keep our entire team together and to keep everyone paid. We're actually in quite good shape right now, both financially and then certainly we've been very productive. People have always asked me, when are you going to open? Holy cow, we never closed. We just closed the galleries in the way that we engage with people there. We've really put a lot of effort and resources into the park. I look more forward to sharing more about that at some time soon. And of course, many of you know that we've put a lot of effort in our digital content as well. And if you haven't checked out our blogs yet, or you haven't participated in others of the video content that we've been producing, definitely check it out after the program today. I did want to give one specific report, and that is that when the galleries reopen, we are going to have some surprises for you. And the biggest among those is our newly renovated Clean Lab. So many of you know that the Mariners Museum is home to the world's largest marine archaeological metals conservation project, the Monitor. And you all are very familiar with walking past that wet lab and being able to look into the glass there and see the conservation going on. Many of you may not know that we actually have a Clean Lab upstairs on the second floor in the Monitor Center there, back in the Baton Conservation Complex. And you wouldn't know that because there's never been public access to it. Well, we've just completed about a 4 or 5 month renovation of that space, which includes opening up public access to the Conservation Lab. So when you return to the galleries, hopefully very soon, you're going to be able to go upstairs and actually see a very active conservation lab and some real cutting edge science going on. And we're super excited about engaging people in that way. So I'm going to stop there because nobody logged on tonight to listen to me. But man, we're happy that you joined us, and we really look forward to seeing you soon. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Julie.
Hello. Am I there? I hope.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Sorry, I'm new to this, but I do miss everybody. I am Julie Murphy, in charge of the lecture series at the museum, and I am thrilled that you have chosen to spend part of your evening with us tonight. I miss you, but very glad that we were able to turn the evening lecture series into an online program. So we'll have at least 3 more coming up before the end of the year, which we'll be sharing with you later. I was raised as sort of a Pollyanna, where you try to find something good out of something bad. And so I think most of you that have attended lectures in the lobby at the museum can share with me that what you're sitting on right now is more comfortable than those little bitty folding chairs that are in the lobby at the museum. So that's the good thing for tonight, that we can sit on our comfy couch, hopefully with friends and family, and enjoy this program. Our lobby would be full tonight if everyone that registered shows up. So that is amazing for our first virtual lecture, and we're not on those little squeaky chairs. Eric Jay Dolin does remain one of our most popular lecturers. We're so happy he could turn around and come back virtually. Like many of us, his love of everything to do with the ocean started as a boy or a girl, I was a girl, and he has a passion for everything from seashells to whales, and it reflects in his work over the years. He started out at Brown University thinking he would be a marine biologist, but being in the lab just wasn't for him. So he switched gears and went into environmental management. After Brown, he went to Yale, that little school up there in the north. And after that, he went to MIT and got a doctorate in environmental policy. So he's a smart guy, but among being smart, he loves to tell stories. He's had a very varied career, but he has definitely found his niche of writing and telling stories, which we appreciate. As a journalist, he has contributed more than 60, and I know that's not a current number, articles for magazines and newspapers, from Time to the New York Times to the Smithsonian, American Heritage, etc. As an author, he has published 6 all award-winning books, including one that you will remember if you were with us the last time Eric appeared for us, Black Flags, Blue Waters, The Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates. His latest book, which is what we're here tonight to hear about, A Furious Sky, The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes, was just released this month. And as he is a finalist for the Creme de la Creme, the Plum Publishing Award, the Kirkus Award. Anyone that follows books knows that that is the bee's knees. He is a finalist, and so we want to send you all of that positive energy because they're going to announce the winner and a $50,000 prize early November. But now let's hear Eric tell us why you signed in tonight to hear about hurricanes from his home in Marblehead, Massachusetts. I give you Eric Jay Dolin.
Thank you very much, Julie and Howard, for that wonderful introduction. Now let me just get the slideshow up here. That should be it. I really do wish that I was there. I always enjoy visiting Newport News, especially this time. I really wanted to go there because I'm currently working on a book on privateering during the American Revolution. And of course, Virginia has a lot of great historic spots that relate to the American Revolution, and I was hoping to visit some of them, but maybe next time. But thanks for coming to this talk. And again, I wish I could be there, but unfortunately not. Now, in writing this book, I came across a whole bunch of phenomenal stories, and I'm just going to tell you a few of them real quickly. One involves the great Colonial Hurricane of 1635, which ripped into New England in August of that year. And right before the hurricane arrived, there was a ship, a small vessel actually, called the Watch and Wait, that was leaving from Ipswich, Massachusetts, heading to Marblehead, Massachusetts, my hometown, my current hometown. On board the vessel were 23 people, including Anthony Thatcher and his wife and 4 of their children. When they were off the coast of Cape Ann, the hurricane roared in, sent the vessel into a rock right off the edge of an uninhabited island. The vessel broke apart. Everybody on board died except for Anthony Thatcher and his wife, who managed to struggle to shore. They lasted there almost naked for 5 days, subsisting on food that had washed ashore. And finally, a vessel came by. They flagged it down. It took them to the mainland on Cape Ann. And the Massachusetts legislature felt so horrible about the ordeal that they had just gone through that it deeded the uninhabited island that he had crashed on to him. And that island is known as Thatcher's Island. Today it is part of Rockport, Massachusetts, and has these 2 wonderful twin lighthouses on it. And then there's a story from the Miami Hurricane of 1926. Just to the north of Miami in Fort Lauderdale, a husband and wife were in their house when the wind and the waves caused it to collapse, pinning the husband under a slab of concrete. As the water crept higher, his wife held his chin up. He kept begging her to leave, but she didn't want to. And finally, as the water got closer to his mouth, she gave him a kiss goodbye and left. Then there's this story from the Great Hurricane of 1938, which slammed into Long Island and part of New England on September 21st of that year. That morning, there was a man on the eastern tip of Long Island. He had long been waiting for a package to arrive from Abercrombie & Fitch. And in that package was going to be a gleaming new barometer. Well, that morning, the morning of September 21st, the package finally made it there. He opened the package excitedly, but when he took out his barometer, his mood quickly soured because the needle on the barometer was pointing to a reading that was so low that it could only mean one of 2 things. Either a hurricane was already there or one was fast approaching. Yet when he looked out to the ocean, the seas were calm and the sun was shining above. So he sat down at his desk and he penned an angry letter to Abercrombie and Fitch. Then he hopped in his car, drove into town, and mailed the letter. He shouldn't have been so rash. By the time he returned, his house and his precious barometer had been washed away by the great hurricane of 1938. Now, Furious Sky contains many more tragic stories like these, but the book is much more than a litany of death and destruction. It also weaves together a great range of captivating themes. There is the intriguing history of meteorology, the influence of hurricanes on the course of empire, the outcomes of war, and the fortunes of individuals adds to the story. Critical innovations in communication, aviation, computer, and satellite technology play an important part, as does the women's movement and its role in the naming of hurricanes. In the end, the history of America's hurricanes forces us to confront thorny questions of how we can learn to adapt and survive to the continued barrage that is sure to come from the greatest storms on earth. Hurricanes are an inevitable and painful part of the American experience. Just as we can count on the sun rising and setting each day, so too can we count on hurricanes periodically visiting our shore. If you're among the many tens of millions of people inhabiting the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean, or Hawaii, hurricanes are looming threats that might invade your lives. The hurricane season officially runs from June 1st to November 30th. In an average year, 6 hurricanes dance over the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes with sustained winds of at least 111 miles per hour. Typically, 2 hurricanes make landfall each year, and a major hurricane strikes us about once every 2 years. Now, hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states, including Virginia, of course, have been hit by hurricanes, residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina, in that order, take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for 40% of all hurricane strikes. Hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for roughly 50% of the cost of all natural disasters that have exceeded $1 billion in damage. And going back to the late 1800s, hurricanes have killed at least 30,000 people. Furious Sky is the history of hurricanes that have struck what is today the United States. But before going any further, a key term must be defined. What is a hurricane? Simply put, hurricanes are violent, swirling storms with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to a depth of about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, giving energy to the storm. 2 other conditions necessary for a hurricane to thrive are low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air that rises from the ocean's surface. As that air rises, it cools and condenses, forming clouds and releasing something called the latent heat of condensation, which powers the storm. Hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to more than 1,000. And incidentally, Hurricane Teddy that just came up the Atlantic was almost 1,000 miles wide at one point. And the hurricanes can be over 50,000 feet high. They rotate in the counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern. They are characterized by extremely low pressure and a relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall. Many people have attempted to describe hurricanes over the centuries, including a teenage Alexander Hamilton, who wrote about a hurricane that barreled into his home island of St. Croix in August of 1772. Of it, he said, "Good God, what horror and destruction! It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into the angels." hurricanes have had a significant impact on the course of colonial history. For example, a hurricane in 1609 smashed into the relief convoy sailing to the Jamestown colony in Virginia, causing the lead ship, the Sea Venture, to crash off of Bermuda, called the Devil's Island at that time. William Strachey, a budding poet and playwright, and one of the Sea Venture's passengers, captured the violence of the hurricane in his essay on what occurred. And part of what he wrote was the following: a dreadful and hideous storm began to blow out of the northeast, which, swelling and roaring, as if it were by fits, some hours with more violence than others, at length did beat all light from heaven, which like a hell of darkness turned black upon us. It took a year for the castaways to build 2 small ships and sail to Jamestown. This hurricane left its mark on history by depriving the colony of leadership and supplies during its most trying time, and by creating the circumstances that ultimately led to the castaways' arrival early the next year, which provided the starving settlers with a lifeline they needed to survive until the next relief convoy arrived. And this map, which was done by John Smith of Virginia, it's oriented wrong. It's not oriented north-south, but just fascinating to think about this map and then think about the maps that we have today of Virginia. Now, another example is when 2 strong hurricanes swept through the Caribbean in the summer of 1780, destroying numerous British and French warships and killing more than 20,000 people, including a huge number of French and British military personnel. Those hurricanes caused the French fleet to decide that staying in the Caribbean during hurricane season wasn't such a good idea. So when the next hurricane season rolled around in 1781, the French fleet sailed north, both to escape the Caribbean, but also to help their allies, the American colonists, in their battle against the British. By following this course of action, the French played a key role in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake, or Battle of the Virginia Capes, and the ultimate American victory over the British in the Battle of Yorktown, which ended when Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington on October 19th, 1781, a major turning point in the war. Of course, hurricanes didn't cease with the founding of the United States, and many hundreds of them have pummeled America's shores for the past 237 years, including the Great September Gale of 1815, which was just a hurricane by another name that slammed into New England. The hurricane seared itself into the memory of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was only 7 years old at the time and would become one of America's most celebrated essayists and poets. Holmes's 1836 poem, titled The September Gale, humorously recounted the passing of the hurricane over his Cambridge home. One of the stanzas told of the storm's dramatic effect on his wardrobe. He wrote, "It chanced to be our washing day, and all our things were drying. The storm came roaring through the lines and set them all a-flying. I saw the shirts and petticoats go riding off like witches. I lost, bitterly I wept, I lost my Sunday breeches." The Galveston Hurricane of 1900 leveled the city and killed at least 6,000 people, perhaps as many as 8,000 to 10,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 ripped through 3 government work camps located in the Florida Keys, killing hundreds of World War I veterans who were there building a highway to Key West. It is still the most intense Category 5 hurricane ever to strike the United States, with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts as high as 200 miles per hour or more. Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Key West at the time, was one of the first responders to offer help to the stricken. After seeing the death and destruction on Lower Matecumbe Key, Hemingway wrote, "The brush was all brown, as though autumn had come to these islands where there is no autumn. But that was because the leaves had all been blown away. The biggest bunch of dead were in the tangled, always green but now brown mangroves. You found them everywhere, and in the sun all of them were beginning to be too big for their blue jeans and jackets that they could never fill when they were on the bum and hungry. At one of the work camps, a doctor came upon a veteran named Elmer Cressberg, who had a 2x4 that had gone clean through his chest, right below his ribs. The doctor wanted to pull out the piece of wood and offered to give Elmer a shot of morphine to dull the pain. Amazingly, Cressberg, who was in fairly good spirits given the circumstances, refused. What he said is that he really wanted a drink because he knew he was going to die anyway once the wood was pulled out. So they went off, they found 2 cold beers, maybe they were warm by this time. They gave them to Elmer, he chugged them down, and then he said to the doctor, pull. The doctor did, and Elmer died immediately thereafter. The Great Hurricane of 1938 delivered a body blow to New England, resulting in damages of $300 to $400 million, killing 680 people, making it the worst natural disaster ever to strike New England. And it is still a hurricane that people in this area talk about to this day. The actress Katharine Hepburn was at her family's Victorian summer home in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, when the hurricane roared ashore. She and 5 other people escaped the house as it was being torn apart and ripped from its foundation. They sought refuge in a nearby inn, which was on a little bit higher land. Looking back, Hepburn would later recall, we saw the house slowly turn around, sail off to the northeast, and start down the brook which fed the swamp lagoon. It just sailed away, easy as pie. Later, she called her father in Hartford to tell him that she, her brother, and her mother were all okay. Her father responded, I suppose you didn't have brains enough to throw in a match before it disappeared. I'm insured for fire. Hurricane Carol, which struck the eastern tip of Long Island and then plowed into New England in late August of 1954, left 60 people dead and caused nearly $500 million in damage. The most iconic casualty of Hurricane Carol was the steeple on the Old North Church in Boston, which tumbled to the ground. It actually was the second time that this steeple had tumbled to the ground as a result of a hurricane. There was an earlier hurricane in the early 1800s that did the same kind of damage. But this time, after Hurricane Carol, the people who run the Old North Church decided that they didn't want Mother Nature to cause any more problems. So the new steeple is reinforced with steel girders. Hurricane Camille in August of 1969 clobbered coastal Mississippi, hitting much the same area that Hurricane Laura a few weeks ago devastated. Of the many people who suffered during Hurricane Camille, none had a greater burden to bear than Paul Williams Sr., the longtime caretaker of the Trinity Episcopal Church in Pass Christian. The night that Camille came ashore, Paul, his wife Myrtle, and many of their children decided to shelter in the auditorium attached to the church. The hurricane demolished the auditorium, and in the end, 11 of Paul's children perished, along with 1 grandchild and his beloved Myrtle. Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. It tore a 30-mile-wide swath of misery through Miami-Dade County. A staggering 126,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, making more than 160,000 people homeless overnight. Total damage approached $27 billion. Zoo Miami was especially hard hit. About 300 rare birds were lost when the zoo's aviary was smashed. To shelter the Caribbean flamingos from the storm, the zoo's staff herded them into one of the men's bathrooms. Hurricanes rarely strike Hawaii, but there have been a few of note, the most memorable being Hurricane Iniki, which made landfall on the Hawaiian island of Kauai on September 11th of 1992. It killed 6 people and cost $3.1 billion. It also forced director Steven Spielberg to cancel the final day of shooting for Jurassic Park. Everyone associated with the movie crammed into the ballroom of the Westin Kauai Hotel to take shelter from the storm. During the hurricane, Spielberg led a camera crew down to the dock to film the massive waves crashing ashore, and that footage made its way into the final film. The crew survived, and a few weeks later, Spielberg filmed one last scene on Oahu, since all of the sets on Kauai had been destroyed. At the end of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged parts of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, costing $125 billion, making it the most expensive hurricane ever to strike the United States. It left about 1,800 people dead in Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana claiming the lion's share. Ground zero for Katrina was the city of New Orleans, which suffered the most devastating blow. Multiple levee failures around the city left 80% of New Orleans submerged in water that was up to 10 feet deep. Tens of thousands of people were stranded in their homes, surrounded by a toxic brew of contaminants that one observer labeled hazmat gumbo. 25,000 people took shelter in the Superdome. With no running water, the bathrooms didn't work, and conditions were horrific. It took the better part of a week for a wide range of organizations and individuals to rescue or respond to the many thousands trapped in homes, hospitals, and businesses. It wasn't until Monday, September 5th, that the Army Corps finally closed all the levees, and by October, the city was finally drained. 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey and New York on Monday, October 29, 2012, killing more than 150 people and resulting in $65 billion in damages. Sandy's waves pounded the shore with such force that their vibrations were picked up by seismographs 2,500 miles away in Seattle. New York City was particularly hard hit. Many subway lines and automobile tunnels were flooded. At one point, close to 1 million Con Edison customers in and around the city lost electricity, and the hits just kept on coming. The 2007 hurricane season, as you might remember, turned out to be one for the record books. In the end, there were 10 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. 4 of those hurricanes roared ashore. But what really set 2017 apart was that 3 out of the 4 hurricanes were major ones. In each of those Category 4s, with winds of at least 135 miles per hour. Never before had there been 3 Category 4s to make landfall in a single year. The damage attributed to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria totaled $265 billion, making 2017 the most expensive hurricane season on record by far. Hurricane Harvey dumped more than 50 inches of rain in Houston in a 48-hour period, with Nederland, Texas getting more than 60 inches of rain, an all-time record. Hurricane Irma maintained winds of 185 miles per hour for an astonishing 35 hours over the open Atlantic, setting a world record for sustained wind speed. When Hurricane Irma slammed into the southern parts of Florida, it destroyed 50% of the orange crop. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a strong Category 4 with winds of 155 miles per hour, and it left up to 3 feet of water in some areas that came down from the sky. Maria damaged or obliterated virtually every human-made structure on the island outside of San Juan and many in the island's capital. And it knocked out power to 3.4 million people, everyone in Puerto Rico. The death toll from Maria has spawned considerable controversy, with estimates ranging from about 1,400 to more than 4,500. And I have to add here that it was the hurricane season of 2017 that caught the attention of my editor at W.W. Norton and the head of sales. And unlike most of my books, where I come up with the topic for a book, for this book, actually my editor and my publisher reached out to me to ask me if I wanted to write a book on the history of hurricanes, and I'm glad I did. Now, while Furious Sky details some of the most destructive and deadly hurricanes to reach our shores, it also recounts pivotal discoveries over the past 3 centuries in the fields of meteorology, aviation, and communications, which have greatly improved our ability to understand, monitor, and report on hurricanes. For example, after studying a hurricane in 1743 that moved from Philadelphia to Boston, Benjamin Franklin, our founding scientist, became the first person to realize that hurricanes had forward movement. and that a hurricane's winds could blow contrary to the direction in which the hurricane was traveling. During the Great Storm controversy in the mid-1800s, arguments between amateur and professional meteorologists alike helped to develop the basic image of a hurricane as a mass of swirling, moisture-laden winds, the velocity of which greatly increases as one moves towards the center, until one finally encounters the surprisingly calm and beautiful eye. The advent of the telegraph, then the radio, followed by hurricane hunter planes, which could fly into the center of a hurricane and send back a huge amount of real-time reporting on the hurricane's various characteristics, and Earth-orbiting satellites all contributed mightily to our ability to track hurricanes from inception to dissolution. Such advances, combined with vast improvements in computer-based weather prediction models, means that we have advanced warnings of a hurricane's strength and the timing of its arrival. There have also been dramatic changes in the way we identified hurricanes. In 1953, the Weather Bureau, the precursor to the modern National Weather Service, began naming hurricanes after women. This is a decision that angered many who thought that it was inappropriate, if not downright insulting, to name hurricanes in this manner, and they asked the Bureau to reconsider. One woman said she would rather have an unnamed hurricane barrel into her house than one named after a girlfriend of her husband, a former girlfriend of her husband. The Bureau, however, would not be swayed. It stuck fast to its naming system, making it permanent in 1956. Protests died down, that is, until Roxy Bolton spoke up. Bolton was a vice president of the National Organization of Women. She's shown here with Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1970, she urged the National Weather Service to stop naming hurricanes after women. She was tired of reading and hearing media accounts in which female-named hurricanes were variously described as witches, capricious, furious, bad girls, unladylike, treacherous. She said women are human beings and deeply resent being associated with disaster. Bolton offered some alternatives. She said hurricanes could be named after birds or perhaps politicians who seemed to love to have things named after them. She even recommended that hurricanes be called himicanes instead. The service refused to budge. Then, during Jimmy Carter's presidency, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Dr. Juanita Krebs, took up the cause. A self-described feminist and the first female Secretary of Commerce, Krebs heartily supported Bolton's initiative, and in 1979, gender equality won out over tired bureaucracy. From that point forward, Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes would alternate between male and female names. But as all of you know, we're living through a rather historic hurricane season right now, and we've already gone through all 21 names on the original list, and now we're well into the Greek alphabet. I don't think we're going to exhaust the Greek alphabet, but this is only the second time that this has happened. And bear in mind that the names go to tropical storms as well as hurricanes. So it's not like we've had 30 or 25 hurricanes. We've had that number of tropical storms and hurricanes. Now, meteorologists have not only been interested in forecasting and naming hurricanes, and for a time, they wanted to control them. From the late 1940s through the early 1980s, there were various government experiments to see whether cloud seeding with dry ice or silver nitrate could weaken hurricanes. None of those experiments worked. Since the mid to late 1900s, many other methods besides cloud seeding have been suggested for controlling and even eliminating hurricanes. Some of the most fanciful ideas include flying an enormous fleet of propeller-driven planes around a hurricane in a clockwise direction to unwind the storm, or towing icebergs from the Arctic to the tropics to cool the ocean water and sap hurricanes of energy. One person even recommended building windmills all along the coast. And when a hurricane is on its way, somehow getting the windmills to start working and blow the hurricane back out to sea. Then there is one of the most popular suggestions of all. Nuke them. Just drop a nuclear bomb in the middle of a hurricane to disrupt it. Well, I hate to tell you, I don't hate to tell you, but I have to tell you that that would not put a dent in a hurricane, given how massive and powerful they are. And of course, we would have to deal with nuclear fallout. The cycle continues. Every year, a new hurricane season unfolds. No matter what an individual hurricane season brings, one thing is certain. The United States will continue to be pummeled by these tremendous storms. And because of global warming, hurricanes of the future most likely will be worse than those of the past. Global warming has already made the impact of hurricanes worse. Because sea level has risen as a result of the thermal expansion of the ocean and the melting of glaciers, storm surges associated with hurricanes are higher and more destructive. For example, a century ago, the ocean level off of New York was a foot lower than it is today. So the same storm surge today is a foot higher than it would have been a century ago in a cooler world. A growing number of studies have found strong evidence linking global warming to increased precipitation in hurricanes. The reason is that warming leads to more evaporation, and warmer air is able to contain more moisture, which can come down as rain. Considerable research also predicts that warmer oceans, which provide more heat energy to fuel the hurricanes, will make the winds produced by these storms even more powerful. Thus, under the warmer conditions that predictions say will be the norm toward the end of this century, it is likely that hurricanes will be stronger and wetter. And unfortunately, there's also a growing body of evidence and research that shows that in a warmer world, hurricanes are likely to linger longer, meaning that they will slow down and drop more rain in one area and also subject that area to a longer duration of punishing winds. At this moment, nobody can say with absolute certainty how hurricanes will change over time as a result of global warming. Scientists would be the first to admit that there are still many unknowns, as well as limitations in the data and modeling that make it exceedingly difficult to predict the impact of a warmer world on these massive storms. The mounting scientific consensus that an increase in global warming will likely make future hurricanes worse, however, is not encouraging. But even if global warming causes no difference at all in hurricane behavior, society still has to grapple with a hurricane-filled future. And as more and more people move to the coasts, the potential impact of hurricanes will only increase. As this book was heading into the final stage of production, Hurricane Dorian riveted the nation. Beginning in late August of 2019, Americans watched the round-the-clock coverage of this rapidly intensifying storm as it marched slowly across the Atlantic. Each day, reports became more alarming as Dorian not only grew into a monster Category 5 storm, but also appeared to be heading directly for the east coast of the United States. But first in line were the Bahamas, parts of which were utterly destroyed by Dorian, which essentially stalled in place, moving for about 40 hours at 2 miles per hour, pummeling the Bahamas. When it moved on, it was only a Category 2 hurricane, but it still appeared as if it was going to strike the East Coast, southern East Coast, the Southeast. So there were evacuation orders put into place from Florida to Virginia. Over the next few days, Dorian hugged the coastline, briefly regaining Category 3 status as it moved over warmer waters, then dropping to Category 1 just before making its only landfall in the United States in Cape Hatteras, before zooming off into the Atlantic, striking Nova Scotia, and leaving 400,000 people there without electricity. While Dorian's impact on the United States was significant, it was virtually nothing compared with what would have happened, or with what happened to the Bahamas, and what might have happened if the hurricane had struck square on the United States coast, instead of skirting the mainland, clipping North Carolina, and heading towards Nova Scotia. This time, America was lucky, but if the history of U.S. hurricanes tells us anything, it is that such luck will not last. I just have one more slide. This is me in 1991 when my hair was brown. My wife, my fiance then, Jennifer, worked for the state of Massachusetts on a tree program. And she was sent down to Falmouth, Massachusetts to look at all the damage to the trees in that area. So I came along, and I am on the beach in Falmouth, and that was a summer cottage that was leveled by the hurricane. And I have to add, on a personal note, that Hawaiian shirt I'm wearing was one of my favorite shirts when I was single. But my wife, my future wife, hated it. So when we got married, that Hawaiian shirt, along with my suede vest, which I also liked, was given to the Salvation Army. And that's about it for my slides. I'm going to stop sharing. And the interesting timing of this book, you know, we are in a very historic hurricane season. I don't know what's going to be in store over the next 6 weeks or so. Actually, more than 6 weeks, 2 months and a little bit. But we're only in the middle. And we've had some of our worst hurricanes at the end of September or in October and even into November. I hope that no more hurricanes hit, because after writing about so many hurricanes for so long, I really think it's horrific and a tragedy when people have to live through a hurricane. But inevitably, we're going to be visited by more hurricanes. And I have a feeling, if you're a betting man, or if I was a betting person, I would bet that in the coming years, a season like the one we're experiencing right now are going to be more likely than not. It's going to be very busy. So thanks. I'll answer any questions if you have any.
All right. So I've got, hello, Eric, it's me again. So we have a couple that were posted in the Q&A box.
Okay.
So one person here said, what sparked your interest to write about the history of hurricanes?
Well, I've long been interested in hurricanes, and I even thought for a time about writing a book on a single hurricane, but the two hurricanes that I wanted to write about, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 and the Great Hurricane of 1938, which struck where I live, both of those hurricanes were very well documented, and they both have excellent books that are written just about them. I did not want to add another book to the long list of good books that were out there. So I put aside my hurricane idea. I wrote a book on lighthouses. I wrote a book on pirates. But then, as I said during the talk, when my editor and the head of sales at my publisher lived through, like the rest of us, the dramatic hurricane season of 2017, there was so much coverage of hurricanes, they thought that a book on the history of all of America's hurricanes would be a good book to have written. And they immediately thought of me because I have a history of writing books that span centuries and synthesize huge amounts of information and use specific topics like hurricanes, pirates, the fur trade, whaling as narrative backbones to tell popular histories about the American experience. So when they approached me with the idea of writing a book about hurricanes, I was primed to say yes, and I'm glad I did. It was a really fun book to write.
All right, great. We have another question here. What should a domicile look like, or where should a domicile be truly located to truly survive a hurricane?
Kansas.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, listen, you can build buildings like lighthouses are great examples, or if you have enough money or smart enough and have a good architect and builder, you can build houses that are right on the coast, maybe only 5 or 10 feet above high tide mark, that'll be able to withstand probably a really horrific hurricane. But it costs a lot of money, and I don't think it's a great idea to build right up to the edge of the coastline. But unfortunately, that's what Americans love. People are continuing to move to the coasts. People love to have an ocean view. If you're fortunate enough to be on a bluff that's high up, well, then there's little risk. But if you're in a floodplain especially, or you're relatively low, like much of the Gulf Coast, you just have to build knowing that occasionally you are going to be clobbered by a hurricane. And depending on how well built, how well you built your house, that's going to determine whether you have a house to go back to or you're going to have to rebuild. But I don't think there's anything that's going to stop people from building along the coast. However, there are many, many things that people can do with good building codes to build better houses and build smarter houses that can withstand the winds and the flooding that come from hurricanes. I love the coast. I live in Marblehead. The beach is a little less than a quarter mile away. However, there are some houses in Marblehead that are only a couple of feet above the high tide mark. And even during nor'easters, which are sort of cold weather hurricanes, their basements get swamped with salt water. My wife grew up in a house that was right across from the beach. And during the great blizzard of 1978, when the waters are huge waves, they got salt water in their basement. Not only salt water, they found a live lobster in their basement the day after. So I just encourage people to pick wisely where they're going to live. And if they're building something, invest wisely so that it can withstand whatever Mother Nature has to throw at you.
Speaking of which, here's a question related to that. February 7th, 1978 was a winter hurricane. Are winter hurricanes unusual?
No, well, winter hurricanes are cold core hurricanes. Essentially, hurricanes are warm core events and occur roughly during the time of hurricane season. But nor'easters, as we experience them up here, and what are called winter hurricanes, feel just the same as a hurricane, although it's not warm, and they have different meteorological characteristics, but they can cause just as much damage. The perfect storm, which struck New England and was the basis for that movie, The Perfect Storm, that was in the winter. That was not a hurricane technically, but it had hurricane force winds, and it certainly had huge waves and storm surge. So I think one thing we've learned during this hurricane season is the label hurricane is not always so important. We've had a couple of tropical storms this season, one that we're dealing with, I guess right now, it just ended a day or two ago, but there are a couple of tropical storms that, although they're not officially hurricanes, they can cause tremendous damage, especially if they stall in place. Because remember, Hurricane Harvey was just a Category 1 hurricane when it struck Texas. It wasn't a Category 4 or 5. So don't be deceived. Any tropical storm, hurricane, nor'easter, winter hurricane, any massive storm coming in off the ocean is going to have a dramatic impact on any structures or people that it encounters.
Great. I have another question here. Do hurricanes have any positive impacts on coastal environments?
Positive impacts. That's one thing. If I went back and wrote the book again, I might spend more time talking about hurricanes' impacts on nature. I have to admit, there's not a lot of that in the book. Off the top of my head, hurricanes are part of the natural cycle, so you have to sort of answer that they're, nature is prepared for them. Animals tend to act differently as hurricanes are coming. I start off the book with a story about Hurricane Audrey and how the crawfish or crayfish sort of knew it was coming because they could sense the pressure change, and they started marching inland. Tarpon and the Florida Keys tend to go in between the Keys into the Gulf of Mexico or some of the bays on the other side to protect themselves from the wrath of a hurricane. A lot of birds act quite different. But hurricanes can destroy ecosystems just as well as they can destroy the human environment. And there are marshes, even though marshes are natural shock absorbers for hurricanes, hurricanes do destroy a lot of marshland and a lot of habitat. But unfortunately, we've destroyed so many marshlands on our own that a lot of the protection they would have afforded in the event of a hurricane has been lost, especially in places like Louisiana. So the answer is yes and no. I mean, animals are better equipped to deal with it. It's part of their life cycle. They've been dealing with it for thousands or tens of thousands of years, perhaps. but many animals get killed during hurricanes. One of the things I talk about in the book is birds often get trapped in the eye of a hurricane and they fly along with the hurricane. So after a hurricane comes from the tropics and goes up to New England, there are cases where birds have dropped out of the sky in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine and Massachusetts that are not native to that area, that are native to the tropics or Bermuda. And so those birds didn't make it, so the hurricane wasn't very good for them.
Awesome. Now I'm looking over in the chat box. We have a couple of questions here. This one's a fun one. What's your top 3 hurricane movie list?
Top 3 hurricane movie list. You know what? I watched a ton of documentaries on hurricanes while writing the book, just as sort of an escape. I know I must have seen some movies that have hurricanes as a central character, but off the top of my head, I can't think of them. So I'm sorry. I watched a bunch of hurricane documentaries, which I thought were fascinating. As my wife would tell you if she was here, I'm very bad at remembering the names of movies or TV shows. So even if I had seen some hurricane movies, I probably wouldn't remember their names. The one that is I guess it is a hurricane, but slightly different is, I think it was called The Day After Tomorrow or something with Jake Gyllenhaal, where it was in the winter though, something, I've seen it twice, but I can't remember the plot, but I know the one scene that I love. I don't love it. I was born in New York. I love New York. But the one scene where the enormous wave higher than the Statue of Liberty roars into Manhattan, and Jake Gyllenhaal and the other characters have to retreat to the New York Public Library, which I love because I spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library over the years. Unfortunately, to keep warm, they had to burn books, which is not something I'm in favor of generally, but in that circumstance, I guess it was okay. So I think that's technically a hurricane movie, even though it was sort of a really bad nor'easter, exceptionally bad nor'easter.
Okay, great.
Oh, Key Largo. I see somebody wrote down Bogart movie, Key Largo. I've never seen that. I like Humphrey Bogart. I've seen African Queen.
Great. Okay, let's see here. Yeah, a lot of questions going on. Do you have any recommendations for improving public education and communication about hurricanes?
Yeah, I think it's great what a lot of meteorologists are doing. A lot of meteorologists over the years have become their local celebrities, and they go into schools and they give talks about different weather events. And I think that any area that's prone to hurricanes would do well for their elementary schools, junior high schools, and even high schools to invite local meteorologists in to give a talk on hurricanes or other severe weather events. One thing I'm generally in favor of is just kids reading more history, not just about hurricanes, about anything. So you could, of course, read, there are other books on hurricanes in addition to mine that could be read. But in today's society, unless you're living under a rock or you're not really paying attention, you should have a lot of basic information about hurricanes. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation that's out there, and there are people that the media calls social meteorologists who get online and make predictions about storms and other stuff that aren't always correct. So I would just say, as in everything, be a wise consumer, trust your sources, but with everything between the Weather Channel to your local TV station, to the radio reports on weather, to all the documentaries and movies that have hurricanes in them, I mean, there's a huge amount of information. Nobody who's living in a hurricane-prone area should be ignorant of the basic characteristics of the hurricane, should be ignorant of the destructive history of hurricanes, and they should pay special attention to their local public officials who ask them to evacuate and not hold them so accountable. And what I mean by that is there are many instances, I talk about some of them in the book, where local political officials declare an evacuation, and then the hurricane, which can't be predicted with 100% certainty, hits a different area. So the people who evacuated, they actually didn't have to evacuate because their area wasn't directly struck. And they often get upset and they lash out at the public officials who cause them to leave their home and shut down local businesses. And it's the same thing that happens with snowstorms up here in New England. The one thing a politician doesn't want to do is shut everything down and the storm ends up only dropping an inch of snow. So I would ask people to be a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more understanding, take evacuation orders seriously. And if for some reason the hurricane that was predicted to hit your area moves 50 miles to the east or west and you escape it, you should be thankful and happy, not angry that you were asked to evacuate. And I have to tell you, in reading about a lot of hurricanes, it's amazing how many people do get angry at their local politicians who are just and meteorologists who are just trying to do their best in what is always a highly uncertain situation. But just think how much more certain it is now than it was 30, 40, 50, 80 years ago. We are living in a golden age of weather reporting. So nobody should be caught off guard by an approaching hurricane. And I don't recommend people staying in their houses right along the coast if a big hurricane is scheduled to come and having parties, which actually there are a couple of instances in history of people having hurricane parties or going down to the beach during a hurricane. I don't think it's a great idea. But then again, I'm a pretty conservative person when it comes to life and limb.
Great. I've got another question here. Is there a difference between a bomb cyclone and a hurricane? There was a bomb cyclone off Iceland in February 2020.
Yeah. You know, here's where I'm going to say I can't really answer it. I did read about bomb cyclones, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head the meteorological distinctions between the two. But a quick search on Google will get you the answer. And I just want to add that one of the things about all these books that I write, I've written 14 books, they're almost all on topics I don't know much about. I'm not a meteorologist. My PhD is in environmental policy. I know a lot about hurricanes now, but there are certain things about hurricanes that I just didn't read up on or I don't know. And I gladly turn the mic over to the true experts, who I will add, just to give myself a pat on the back, a number of meteorologists, people that actually know, that do this day in and day out, have read my book and have reached out to me and said they really enjoyed it. So that's one of the nicest things that I've heard, because I like my books to be helpful to the general reader, which is who they're mainly written for, but also for people who are immersed in that field of endeavor. And I think there'll be things that they can learn as well. So I'm sorry I can't answer your bomb cyclone question directly, but I'm sure with a few keystrokes, you'll get a better answer than I could have given anyway.
Another thing here in the Q&A box, it's more of a comment. As far as environmental effects, locally here in the Hampton Roads region, locally a great hurricane in the 1700s created Willowby Spit.
Oh, wow.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the geography, but it's a large spit of land that is now where the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel goes through.
Oh, well, no, I'm not, but that's very common. I mean, one thing up here on Cape Cod, if you've ever been to Cape Cod is just a huge spit of sand. There's not much solid there, and it's moving all the time. But hurricanes and nor'easterns regularly create new inlets along the coast, turn some areas into barrier beaches or islands. So that's pretty common wherever there's easily movable substrate.
Great. I have another one here. I know that our categorization of hurricanes is relatively recent, but is there a way that it can be applied to past hurricanes? So
Yeah.
I'm guessing historic hurricanes.
Excellent question. The National Hurricane Center and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service are all part of the same group. They have some absolutely wonderful, very dedicated meteorologists who, like archaeologists of history, have gone back through the written record all the way to 1851, and they have basically come out with a report, and you could find it online, where they take every single hurricane that is known from 1851 to the present and give them a category based on what was known about the barometric pressure, the devastation, the surge height, and other factors. So yes, even though the Saphir Simpson wind scale didn't come into use until about 1970, you can go back and you can find the category for hurricanes that go back to 1851.
Awesome. Let's see here. Here's another one. Can a human being know that a tropical storm or hurricane is coming by expanding pressure in one's ears?
Yeah, well, actually, it's the pressure lowers as the hurricane's coming, especially when it's near. There's a ton of anecdotal evidence, and I believe it's real because the human body reacts to external stimuli. About people, for example, I read a number of accounts where people have arthritis or joint disease. Oftentimes when the barometric pressure goes very low, it acts up a little bit, and it causes problems. I'm sure that when a hurricane is overhead and you go in and out of the eye, that you could certainly have your ears popping just because of the wind whipping by and the pressure fluctuating so dramatically in a short span of time. As to other ways that human beings can be sensitive enough to have their body react during a hurricane, I don't know of many other ways. Other than being, hit by something during the hurricane, that would be a pretty strong reaction.
Definitely. Here's another one. Why do hurricanes that form off of Africa not veer south or towards South America?
Well, it has to do with the Coriolis effect. The Earth is spinning quite rapidly, as you know, and as it comes off the tip of Africa and goes over the Cape Verde Islands, once the storms start to gain some cohesion and some circulation and go from a disturbance to a tropical storm, as they're swirling and moving, the wind wants to go into this low pressure in the center. As it's going into the low pressure center, it's veering to the right. That's a little bit of it, but also it has to do with the larger circulation patterns. There are three big circulation patterns from the equator north where air is sinking and rising. And that has an impact on the steering winds. And hurricanes, if they get too close to the equator, there is not enough of a spin. I don't know how to describe it, the angular momentum. That's why you don't get hurricanes within about 5 degrees, maybe 10 degrees of the equator, because the conditions are not right. So the equator area is a hurricane killer, not a hurricane former. So hurricanes that are further south can go into the southern hemisphere, but when they're coming off Africa, they're high enough. So the tendency is to either go across, sometimes they go across and go down a little bit into Central America, but mostly they come across and they tend typically to curve to the northwest, or they can go into the Gulf of Mexico or the northwest, and then they go around the Bermuda High and sometimes hit the United States, other times miss, and then get sent skidding off towards England and France, and they lose power. And by the time that they hit the European continent, they're not hurricanes. There may be one or two examples in history where something had hit England and the winds were still hurricane force. But so again, I want to. This doesn't belittle the book at all. I love the book and I think it's great. But in writing it, I read some pretty dense science and meteorology books. I watched some very intricate videos that showed the mechanics and the physics and angular momentum and all this sort of stuff that goes into understanding hurricanes. And I have to be honest with myself. I got a C in physics in high school. I am not particularly good in hard sciences. And I had a hard time understanding the real nitty-gritty of the science that goes into meteorology. And if you pick up a meteorology textbook, there's some serious math that's involved in truly understanding the evolution and movement of the hurricanes. So what I did is I stood back, 10,000, 20,000 feet high, and tried to give an overview that is not simplistic, but is simple enough so people like me can understand and get a sense of what's going on.
Excellent. So I got another question here. Does the book contain any stories of ships throughout history that survived a hurricane at sea?
Not a lot that survived. I mean, most of the stories in the book are about either ships that didn't survive, like the one I talked about in Jamestown, the Sea Venture. There is one story about the hurricane of 1938 that's rather graphic. There was a British luxury liner that was not too far south of North Carolina as the hurricane of 1938, called the Long Island Express because it moved so fast. The luxury liner got caught in it and was being bumped all around. And I have one line in there that I got from a contemporary account where all of the high paying passengers were being thrown around the decks, sliding on their own vomit, basically. It was apparently a horrific voyage. They ultimately made it out of the hurricane and survived and did report to mainland facilities about the passage of this massive storm. There's another big story I have in the beginning of the book, which is during the hurricane of 1635. There were two ships. I talked about the Watch and Wait in the beginning that crashed, but there was another ship that had on board a bunch of Puritan separatists from England, and they survived. And what was interesting is on that ship, on that little vessel, was a guy named Richard Mather, who was the grandfather of Cotton Mather, a very famous Puritan preacher. And when he survived this hurricane, he thanked God, and he said God had protected him. The thing that was ironic and sort of an asymmetry is the Watch and Wait had on board a minister who was going to Marblehead, my hometown, to become a minister. He ultimately died, as did many other people on board, yet the person that survived, Anthony Thatcher, believed deeply in God. And so in one case, God decided not to let these people survive, but in another case, these other people survived. And I just thought it was an interesting sort of asymmetry. Both ships had people who were God-fearing on board, yet the outcomes for them were quite different.
Sure. Rains on the just and the unjust, right?
Yeah.
So we've got one here. What is your favorite book about the 38 hurricane?
My favorite book, probably The Sudden Sea by Scotty. What's her first name? Scotty, Scottti. It's called Sudden Sea. That's a really good one. That's fun to read. There's also one, again, here, I'm bad with movies. There's one that I used extensively because it was written by a reporter who was at the New Bedford paper during the hurricane, and he was a cub reporter, and he spent months collecting contemporary accounts of what happened during the hurricane. And it's called, I think, The Wind That Shook the World. That's the name of the book, The Wind That Shook the World. And the author is, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's in my book. It's in the bibliography. You can take a look there, but just look for The Wind That Shook the World. That's a really great, because he lived through the hurricane. So it's got sort of a realness, a verisimilitude. I don't know, that's very powerful. He's also a really good writer, and you see his picture at the back of the book. He looks like he'd be in a grizzled old man in the sea himself. He was a real character, from what I understand. So anyway, so those are two books. There are other books out there that are also quite good.
Looks like that one was written by Everett S. Allen.
That's it, Everett S. Allen. I apologize. He's no longer with us.
Okay, so we've got about 3 more questions here.
Okay.
Does your research indicate storms striking the New England coast has lessened over the past 100 years?
No, New England typically gets a landfalling hurricane about once a decade, or about 10 a century. In a warmer world, I believe, this is my own personal belief, because as the waters off the New England coast warm, and they clearly have become warmer in recent decades, here in New England, we're seeing dramatic impacts on fish species and lobsters moving farther and farther north, and it's having real world impacts on our fishermen in this region. And as you know, a hurricane thrives on warm water. So as the water gets warmer and warmer, farther and farther north, it just makes logical sense that hurricanes heading up the coast are not going to encounter the cold water that they historically have encountered, and that warm water might sustain them in a powerful state longer. So my prediction is, and I think many meteorologists would agree, that in a warmer world, we may not get more hurricanes up in New England. We may. They don't quite know about the frequency of hurricanes. That's even harder to figure out. But the ones that make it up north, if we continue to warm the ocean, there's a good chance that they're going to be more powerful than the ones we've traditionally dealt with. I don't think there's never been a Category 4 hurricane that I'm aware of that's struck New England, landfall. There's been a Category 3. Just imagine if a Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane slammed right into Boston. Boston is a city that's trying desperately to figure out how to deal with global climate change. The waters have gotten higher. There's been more flooding in downtown. And if you've ever been to Boston, you know that a lot of Boston is on the edge of Boston Harbor. And we've had nor'easters in the last couple of years that have caused numerous streets down near the coast, near the harbor, to have to shut because they're under 3 or 4 feet of water. Just imagine if a Category 4 or Category 3 hurricane comes and the worst right side of the hurricane plows into Boston. It's going to be devastating.
Here's one you slightly touched on in your talk. How much impact do you think sea level rise will have on the impact of hurricanes?
Well, it basically, the easy way to think about it is if you can imagine the storm surge that took place in a hurricane in the past, and you look to your local area, because sea level doesn't rise uniformly throughout the world. It's gone up quite a bit in New England and New York. I don't know what the comparable sea level rise is for Virginia, but let's say it's gone up a foot down in Virginia as well. Then you can look at past storms like Isabel, which I know affected your area a lot, and consider the damage and just extrapolate what might have happened if the same storm, same trajectory, same power was starting, it had a foot more of water to deal with. Things would have gone up a foot higher at least. So if the oceans keep getting warmer, if more of glaciers melt and sea level rises considerably, it's not just a problem for hurricanes, it's a problem for all the millions of people who have built very close to the coast and are in areas that even under today's conditions get flooded periodically. So there's no alternative. It's going to get worse. How much worse and how fast is a big question.
Okay, so we have one last question here. It says, what about the Great Lakes? Can there be hurricanes associated with them?
Yeah, this is another thing I didn't read a lot. There's a book called The Great White Hurricane, which is about a massive storm that barreled into the Great Lakes. And I think it's the one, what's that great song about the guy who sang the song Brandy, You're a Fine Girl. He also sang a song about a ship sinking in the Great Lakes. Oh, it's a famous song. I can't remember, but that's the storm.
The Fitzgerald?
The Fitzgerald, yeah, the Edmund Fitzgerald. There isn't any storm that occurs on the Great Lakes is I mean, if it occurs in the summer, if it occurs during warm weather and it has the same characteristics as a hurricane, then you'd have to call it a hurricane. But I'm not aware of any hitting the Great Lakes between June and November that have caused that kind of devastation. But again, it's not something that I spent a lot of time reading about. I do know, however, that the Great Lakes, because they're like oceans, they have massive waves and they have their own weather systems, not just snow, but also massive storms. So maybe there's something that's technically been called a hurricane that struck the Great Lakes. But if you want to find out about that particular storm, there is this book, I think it's called The Great White Hurricane, because it was in the winter. I think it involved a lot of snow as well. I haven't read the book, so I can't vouch for it, but you might start there.
Great. Well, it looks like that was all the questions. So take it away, Julie.
Thanks.
Eric, you got rave reviews from all of us mariners. We appreciate your patience in answering all the questions, and it was just terrific to be able to interact almost live with you. So we want you to keep us posted on your next book, of course.
Okay.
and come down here and do some research in our fabulous library and archives soon.
Yes.
And we do thank you so much. I do want to let those of you watching know that our next evening lecture is October 22nd, and we will have the what he calls the bon vivant entertainer, author, lecturer, professor, Buddy Levy. He's quite a character. You may recognize him from being on the History Channel with Brad Meltzer's Decoded series, as well as he will be talking about his book, Labyrinth of Ice, which is another fabulous award-winning book by an award-winning author, such as Eric. And we look forward to that on October 22nd, and more to come after that. And again, thank you all. We do miss seeing you in person, but thank you for joining us this evening. And Eric, always great to have you back with us. Look forward to next time.
Thank you very much for having me, and I do look forward to seeing you in person in the future.
Good. Well, thank you. And be safe up there, and we will be talking soon. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks a lot.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Night.